Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. It turns out that entry-level 4K gaming monitors are pretty cheap these days. You can find plenty of options for less than $500 US, and some of the absolute cheapest options are available for less than $350. Today, I'm not looking at the absolute cheapest 4K monitor on the market, but one that costs around $450 and promises HDR in addition to 1 millisecond response times. The monitor is the BenQ EL2870U. It's nothing fancy, it's a 28-inch 3840 by 2160 TN panel at 60Hz, basically just your regular 4K monitor specs. It does support FreeSync, but the refresh rate range is just 40 to 60 Hz, so it doesn't support low frame rate compensation, which is a bit disappointing. BenQ also makes a big deal about this panel supporting HDR, and specifically HDR10, but, well, I guess we'll talk more about HDR later. The design, this is an entry-level monitor, so I wasn't expecting anything fancy, but the EL2870U is a bit of a chunky beast, not just in the overall thickness of the panel, but also in the bezels. At 18mm in thickness, this is definitely not a slim bezel display, and to make matters worse, the panel itself isn't flush with the bezels, instead it's set back about 4mm. I appreciate BenQ's choice not to include a lot of gamer junk, but the large bezels and recessed display make it look pretty cheap. The display's outer construction is also a cheap basic plastic with a bog standard finish. The stand uses an uncommon, I guess you'd have to say, T-shaped design, and the front section at first glance looks like it might be metal, but on closer inspection it's basic plastic with a brush texture. The rest of the stand uses black glossy plastic, which is an absolute nightmare to keep dust and fingerprint free. In terms of adjustability, again, everything is very basic as the stand only supports tilt adjustment, though there is VESA mounting support. For inputs, we get two HDMI 2.0 ports and DisplayPort 1.4 plus a headphone jack, and yes, there are built-in speakers. You also might have noticed this lump below the BenQ logo on the front. That's an ambient light sensor that forms part of BenQ's Brightness Intelligence Plus technology, or BI+. Basically, with this mode enabled, the monitor will automatically adjust brightness and color temperature to fit your surroundings. That's pretty neat for those that like this sort of functionality, but personally I prefer a static brightness and especially static color temperature such that color accuracy is maintained. The BI Plus mode is enabled through a button on the front panel, which also doubles as an HDR button, but don't get fooled. The HDR mode is either force enabled when Windows HDR and WCG setting is enabled, or it can be toggled to simulate HDR when the monitor is receiving an SDR input. And by simulate, I mean mess with the colors and saturation to make the image less accurate. The rest of the display's controls are accessed through a row of basic buttons, so no directional toggle, which makes the OSD hard to navigate. There's a healthy selection of color controls to be found in the OSD, but a lot of BenQ's other features I'd never bother enabling, like the low blue light mode, the super resolution mode, or the plethora of display modes. Let's talk about HDR, because the EL2870U's support of HDR is listed as practically the first item on BenQ's website. It's also one of the few 28-inch 4K TN monitors to support HDR, which I suspect is why it's being marketed around $100 more than the cheapest monitors of equivalent specs. But in reality, the EL2870U is not an HDR monitor. It fails to support the three pillars of good HDR, which are increased brightness, increased contrast, and increased color space. And it fails almost every item in my HDR display checklist, which I discussed in this video. One of the corners will have that there. I could do a comprehensive analysis of this monitor in the HDR mode, but the checklist really tells the whole story. This panel is only capable of 300 nits of peak brightness, which isn't even enough to get the panel Display HDR 400 certified. 300 nits is not enough to convey bright highlights or flashes, so you'll be left with an SDR viewing experience in that regard. The panel does not support local dimming of any kind. Local dimming is key for LCD panels as it allows very bright and very dark areas to coexist on the screen at the same time, essentially raising the contrast ratio of the panel. Without local dimming, this monitor is stuck at its basic 1000:1 contrast ratio, which isn't high enough to convey the high dynamic range aspect of HDR. The panel can adjust its entire backlight on the fly, similar to traditional dynamic contrast modes, but this is only useful when lighting changes between scenes or frames, not when lighting differs within the frame. And the backlight can't even get that bright anyway, so again, an SDR experience. And finally, the panel doesn't support a gamut larger than sRGB, so you're getting SDR level colors rather than the wider gamut supported by true HDR displays. BenQ does list 10-bit color support, which is true, and this is the most basic requirement of HDR and is really the only requirement to support HDR10 and Windows WCG mode, and it's only 10-bit processing anyway. The panel itself is 8-bit plus FRC. I did test the HDR mode briefly, but it was immediately clear that this panel can't match true HDR displays, as you would have seen in the checklist anyway. BenQ really shouldn't be marketing this monitor as an HDR monitor. I'd recommend anyone buying it just keep it on the SDR mode. Moving on from that, let's look at SDR performance, because there's a chance this monitor could still be a standout, non-HDR display. As we're still talking about an entry-level product, this monitor does use a TN panel, so viewing angles are average, though surprisingly not terrible as I expected for this technology. Brightness is acceptable for most indoor users at around 285 nits, which falls a touch short of BenQ's 300 nit claim. Contrast ratio, though, is one of the weaker aspects of its performance at just 820:1 or thereabouts. TN is the worst technology for contrast ratio, and that's on show once again with these mediocre out-of-the-box results. Default color performance is average, not terrible, not amazing, just fine for an entry-level display. A grayscale Delta E average of 3.0 is, again, it's pretty average, but like with a lot of monitors, the CCT average is a little wacky out of the factory. The most disappointing aspect is the default gamma of below 2.0, which really should be 2.2 as shipped. Performance is similar in saturation and color checker tests, with Delta E averages between 3.0 and 4.0. No standout issues here, just a typical out-of-the-box experience from this sort of display. It is possible to improve performance through tweaking a few OSD settings. Using these settings here, which mostly focus on user color changes, I was able to improve the grayscale Delta E to 1.90 and largely fix the gamma curve, although gamma is slightly too high now. It's also very difficult to fix the CCT curve without full calibration, hence the weird shape you're seeing here. Saturation and color checker tests do improve thanks to these tweaks, but we're still not in the territory of a fully calibrated display, at least when looking at the color checker results. That said, this is a pretty decent result from mere OSD calibration. Plenty of displays don't allow you to get to this point. As you might expect, running a full calibration using SpectralCal's CalMan 5 software tightens up most areas of this display's performance. We get much better gamma and CCT curves, and both saturation and color checker tests are tightened to a Delta E average under 2.0. That said, as you can see from the saturation chart, blue performance remains a little loose despite calibration. The good news is calibration doesn't impact the contrast ratio significantly, falling to around 801:1, which is better than other TN panels I've tested. Calibrated power consumption is also decent for a display of this size at 52 watts. As for display uniformity, well, the EL2870U isn't exactly the most uniform display, though high-grade uniformity is typically reserved for professional monitors rather than budget displays like this one. Still, I'd like to see a more uniform backlight, especially as this isn't a curved display. Edge uniformity is slightly better than some curved displays I've reviewed, but it's not as fantastic as other flat panels. Now we get into the interesting stuff, response times. BenQ has used a TN panel here and claimed 1 millisecond response time, so I guess that's a typical figure for TN displays. However, in practice, average gray-to-gray response times aren't even close to 1 millisecond. I recorded a 6.53 millisecond average, and there were only a few transitions that approached 1 millisecond. 50% white to black was around 1.3 milliseconds, and full white to full black around 2.0 milliseconds, but most other transitions were well above the 5 to 6 millisecond mark. So once again, we've got a manufacturer using an unrealistic minimum gray-to-gray metric rather than an average. This TN monitor is also pretty slow in general. A 6.5 millisecond average puts it well in the territory of VA and IPS displays, but without the benefit of those panels like increased contrast ratios and superior viewing angles. Transitions were within the 16.7 millisecond refresh rate window, but the results are still very disappointing for a TN panel. It gets even worse when you factor in the input lag. The EL2870U is the slowest display I've tested so far, with a significant amount of input lag. I'm not quite sure what the panel is doing. Perhaps BenQ simply opted for a cheap and slow scaler. I guess whatever is the case, there's a lot of input lag, which is not great news for gamers. There's not a whole lot more to say on the BenQ EL2870U. It's on the cheaper end of 4K monitors with a TN panel and basic design, and across our performance test, this monitor ranges from average to poor. It's possible to calibrate the monitor to a reasonable enough standard using OSD controls, but uniformity is poor, as are response times and input lag, particularly for a TN display. The EL2870U is currently available for $440, which is, to be honest, a bit too expensive for what this monitor offers. I don't see any compelling reason to buy this BenQ option over $300 to $350 monitors with near identical specs from Samsung, LG, or others, especially considering this monitor's chunky and unimpressive design. If HDR was legitimately functional and worked well, then perhaps you could justify spending an extra $100 to get HDR, but this isn't a true HDR monitor despite BenQ's advertising, so it's definitely not worth even considering its HDR support in your purchasing decision. It's a disappointing conclusion, really. I like budget displays and it's great to see such cheap 4K monitors on the market these days, but budget-conscious shoppers should have their eyes on the plethora of $300 options instead. That's it for this review of the BenQ EL2870U. If you like this review, consider giving it a like, subscribe for more monitor reviews, and consider supporting us directly through our Patreon page. I'll catch you next time.